we don't live in a vacuum, and so there's always a soundtrack to my life, and that doesn't have to be coming from Spotify or from my sound system. The plane that I hear going overhead, even if there is no music playing or the car doors being slammed, there's always a sound that is concurrent to whatever is taking place. And so in terms of the the different projects or types of work that I engage with, it's not as if I detach I detach my thinking for this or for that. Um, as I get dressed, that's that's a form of design. As I have a conversation, um, as we were starting to say earlier, conversation is I've learned in the last year is now one of my design tools, which kind of came out as a result of having to analyze my workflow and work process during lockdown, but really valuing the aspect to be able to talk. And so then when I start thinking about the different elements that are all part of what make up the creative expression or working through a brief or coming up with concepts, getting dressed, um, having a conversation, designing something, be it by hand or on the screen. These are all multi-layered experiences, and the way that I approach my creative practice, it's almost in that same way. And kind of it could be art direction, it could be a curation, it could be an element of styling, it could be an element of design. But I, or as when working with the studio, I know less one thing or the other, and so people will often say, "Oh, but you do so many things." I'm like, "But we all do so many things," and
Mm.
it's just that I've not chosen to um, funnel or segregate. They're specific, and there's an aesthetic that happens or an identity, even if it's not just based on the aesthete idea of it, but it's the idea of actually there's so many things that happen concurrently. I would go to the kitchen, you'll smell food, you'll cook. That's another creative expression, but you wouldn't say that, oh, I only get dressed or I only cook. But we have to do all of those things. And so for me, with the workflow, it's the different creative expressions that have been built over a number of years, which there's a synergy and there's a thread which runs
Mm.
through all of them when I'm passionate about all of the different aspects at to less or greater degree depending on the particular project. But yeah, that's how.
So when you say that you're rethinking, or so what are you rethinking? Are you rethinking what, or are you rethinking how?
um I'm no I'm rethinking or kind of reframing. I think reframing who rather
Okay,
because I believe
that is cool.
the I believe the the what in some senses will be still an extension of what takes place, but it's the idea that I need to rethink about who it is that I present in order that allows me to think a bit um more laterally about the work that I do, because I feel as a trained as an interior architect, then worked in fashion for many from for I work in fashion for many years, um, and that intersects with music and sound is really important to what I do. But often it's been the idea that um, how to have all of those elements coming together. So from my beginnings, I was learning about architecture, but then was always really into fashion. And I think it started there that I'm learned my love for wanting to go to Japan and was learning about Tadao Ando or Kenzo Tang or Nigel Coates' early work in Japan. But then I would be working part time in a clothes store, so I didn't separate. But whilst reading The Face and ID, so I'd be reading Blueprint magazine and ID magazine at the same time. But my interest didn't, and then was DJing to keep myself going through university.
Yeah.
All of those things were happening, and the same level of energy, me working as a part time job at, at uni, was the same as me, the study factor, and then the same as the music factor. So but so I'd lost my train, but it's the idea that being trained as a designer and working as a designer, and often I feel like a service provider, as opposed to thinking in the work in the way that, and you might approach art, and then in terms of service provider, service provider as a designer means that I'm looking for a solution. Whereas when I think about things from maybe my head as as an artist, it's maybe thinking about what would be the question. And so it's how do I bring more questions back into the work as opposed to framing my work around solutions, because I need to get this done because I have a deadline and the client has a brief, and even though I will pose more questions to them, the ultimate aim is usually to find a solution. Whereas the reframing means that I wish to allow more questions in who I am and in the work that I do.
So it is a sort of an existential kind
Yeah,
of
crisis.
reflection. Reflection. I didn't want to say crisis.
Yeah, definitely, and it's the idea that how do I wish the next few years of the work for the foreseeable future, what do I want that to look like? And even that as the question, what do I want my work to look like, is almost enough of a starting point, rather than where do I want to be, or what do I want to do, what do I want the work to look like, is enough to then start, oh actually this is a reframing, as opposed to making a list of I need to be here and this would define my success. But actually, if the succeeding is defined by the questions that I'm asking, then I think it allows a bit more openness.
But are you trying to also define it in relationship to your identity? Because you also said who who you are
Definitely. The
in that
last,
quest.
definitely. There's a project that we launched about, yeah, it was a year ago, with a series of conversations called Tings, and it's a it's a platform essentially where which I what we call it a conversation. There's product attached to it, which we create, which we repurpose from Africa and from India, and but it looks at the identity of the African diaspora, and that's how the reflection of the products and the conversation, that's the starting point. And so therefore, feeling the idea that actually I'm free to be able to explore my identity through this platform that we've created, through this conversation, and it then can become an ongoing dialogue and conversation that is me, but they can also be almost like an alter ego way of expressing different ideas, which can run parallel to other work that we do.
Because I think it was interesting. I was listening to one of your talks that you gave. I think it was Liverpool. Probably was right before lockdown, so maybe
Yeah,
early 2020.
yeah,
And I thought it was quite nice how you were reflecting on your kind of family history and your mother coming from Jamaica, was it, to London and working at the Tower of London.
yeah.
And so you were, and this is sort of pre-pandemic, and you were already kind of exploring or putting things in relationship to family history.
Yes.
But then but there's a lot that happened since then. Both the pandemic,
Yes.
the Black Lives Matter, and various other things, the
Yeah.
the election in America and all that
True.
kind of stuff. So what did that do to your kind of initial going back to these questions of origin and
Um,
history? And
Initially, they upset my equilibrium in terms of, but in some ways, in a good way. Upset as it caused me to start refacing how I would then present. So from that talk that you referenced, where it's the idea that there's not very much archiving within the um Caribbean aspect of the African diaspora through kind of legacies of teaching and framing what the culture or what that identity should be. And so it's put me in a space where I already engaged with different projects and exhibitions where an element of archiving and telling stories that hadn't really been shared before. Whereas now, my a large part of the purpose mechanic in how I work is to be able to make that an integral part of the narrative. I use this phrase, culture without compromise, and the idea that not just my culture, but that's where it has starts with me. But whether I work with brands or galleries or institutions, it's kind of what is the culture that we're uncovering, because it's understanding culture and the element of community coming together within culture. That's the apex or the pivoting point that really inspires me. So that whole last year was it was really turbulent. It was definitely really turbulent, and what precipitated the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement of George Floyd made me really stop to make a deciding point of what is it that I wish to share and what is it that I wish to say, which becomes, which of old was quite a hard thing as a designer, because you're there. For me, it's my work should speak for itself, and mm, my identity is within whatever aspect that I create, because I don't create it in in a vacuum. But very often it's just purely about what we might be doing for them over there. Whereas now it's actually still with that in mind. It's not just about my identity has to infuse every single project. If I get a client brief, it's not about Harris and his Jamaican identity and his Japanese travels. It's about what's relevant for the particular brief. But I'm much more mindful and feel able to be myself if actually something contravenes what I would feel would be acceptable for me to say. Whereas in the past, even a couple of years ago, a client asked me to make a film, and the referencing was from Jamaican culture, but at the end of it, they were really adamant that I had to have a one of the models that we used, or one of the dancers, was going to be white. And in the end, I was at the point where I was like, I just need to get this made. I haven't got time to argue over your political decisions. Whereas now, I wouldn't allow that kind of political agenda to step in when they presented the references to me in the first place. I didn't go to them and say, this is what I'd like to do. They came to me, this is our starting point. We would love you to create it. So then I would even, if someone's going to be as adamant, I'll walk away, because actually what you're asking me to do actually undermines my identity and the cultural relevance and truth for the story that you want me to tell. And there's no point me telling a story if it's not gonna be as true as possible.
I think within your work, what struck me as very interesting and very kind of authentic, even though we can talk about that word authenticity later. But it is your interest, say, in Japan and Japanese culture. And it is something that, I think when you speak to, say, young Black artists, they often say, well, I want to be recognized as an artist, not particularly not as a kind of categorized as a Black artist. So no one should expect from me to use colorful sort of African color schemes in order to present my identity. That is really, but I think what you do in your work, you actually embrace your interests beyond what would be expected. So I think this is something that I thought was very interesting. So can you reflect on that and that kind of sense of just following your interest regardless where it takes you?
Well, often there's the idea that within culture or in media, as a Black person, you're rarely defined purely as the artist. The prefix of your race has to go before you. And if I look at if you look at if you go to Africa, say whichever part of the continent, blackness is not even really referred because the majority culture is black. So you don't need to say, oh yeah, did you see that black guy over there or that black taxi? That your race is not defined because it's about who you are. It's only within still being within the colonial based countries or where your your race ends up having to define so much of your cultural and your artistic output. So the idea that it was architecture that gave me my first love for Japan, um, I it was because of purely I loved it from a design context, and then fell in love with the culture, the food, the taste, and so many other aspects of it. And that then doesn't contravene me being black and being inspired by Japan in the same way that I could go to the south of England and be see what a local community might do and be so from a human point of perspective, there's it's finding the different things that inspire me from a guttural point of view where actually it's connected with my instincts and I'm motivated because of that connection that I have with that shape, that building, that silhouette, that taste. And I've built a number of relationships with different Japanese designers, and one in particular, Takeo Kikuchi. And it just so turns out that he and I have worked together for about 5 years now, and we share the same birthday. So even though it might feel like a tenuous link in some ways, it became this other point of us coming together. And Takeo Kikuchi, as a designer in his early 80s, was one of the first Japanese designers who chose not to come to Europe to make their mark, but he would always bring culture to Japan. So Nana Cherry first went to Japan, going to be on a Takeo Kikuchi show. Same for her husband Cameron. That's how she met the whole Buffalo, Ray Petrie, Dexys Midnight Runners. Takeo Kikuchi would bring over mods to Japan. He would bring over Harlem gospel choirs. He would bring over Rastafarians. He would bring over so many different cultural elements that he found fascinating. And even though he didn't have a good command of the English language, and still to this day, but he was the culture that moved him and inspired him, rather than him come in and let me be part of culture over here or in the States. Being a huge Anglophile, let me bring the culture here and let that culture permeate and be in its purest form within this space. And so there's the idea that my working relationship with people like Takeo and other Japanese people that I work with comes from a really instinctive place of appreciation of each other's way of being. So it's your craft, but it's also the sensibilities. And so very often when working with new Japanese kind of companies and clients, after a while, a lot of your mannerisms, they will say, almost feel like they're Japanese, which clearly I'm not Japanese. I
Yeah.
don't have any Japanese in my. But there's other kind of um, layers within us that actually connect on so many other frequencies that aren't based on race or but actually based on communication and based on again based on language or lack thereof. But the idea that actually I don't need to necessarily be able to speak your audible language in order to be able to engage with you. There's something, whether we'd call it on a spiritual or an instinctive level, where we can work and communicate where language isn't a barrier because we have another kind of understanding.
Exactly. And there are these connections that are not kind of superficial
Yeah.
connections. Because you could say that the color of the skin is a kind of a superficial element. I mean, it's not, but there is so much history and pain, unfortunately, related to it. But it should be a superficial because there are no biological differences between people.
No. So the differences become cultural, but
Yeah.
as a result of our heinous past on this earth, the differences become more poignant. And if, say, referring back, say, to my mum first coming to this country, and her journey and her experiences of that Windrush generation, they grew up under British rule, being a colony. So in school, and you only speak English is what you speak in Jamaica. You the what how they learn to write, to read, to deal with any form of subject matter comes from English curriculums. So then when they came to the UK, the belief was that actually this was an extension of where we live apart from the climate. That's the only thing we're going to have to adjust to. But with that invitation of us being here, actually we have the same news, we have everything. Our leaders are European or of European origin, and all of those different aspects. So then it became that discord when they arrived, and actually, oh, we learn all about England and about Britain and about everything that it has to offer, but when we're not welcome here. So there's that point where identity becomes even further enforced on you in terms of your differences are not just, oh, actually you eat different foods and you wear different clothes, but actually there becomes this separation around, or an exclusion zone in terms of how we will interact with you. So in terms of how race and identity comes in, it came in at that point when that generation came believing that actually, well, we're British anyway because we are a British colony, but actually when you arrive, no, actually you're not.
Your work shows it kind of presents itself as a very light in terms of how you transcend those boundaries and borders. But I presume is not. I mean, I presume.
There's a lot of heaviness that goes in, and but I take a lot of the reference in from Jamaican culture, in the sense that of, oh, there'll be a song made about absolutely everything, from if it's about horse racing, if it's about hair, if it's about politics. It's not just so often saying the West, our subject matters around music making would be about love or about emotion or about it. It would be enclosed around there. Whereas within Jamaica, the making of music becomes like a news feed. So I grew up with the song "Long Shot, Kick the Bucket," and it's all about this horse that fell at the hurdle just before he won the race, and you grow up with this sense that anything can be shared. So it is literally, and the DJs and the musicians will go into these studios and make new records constantly, like daily, weekly. They'll be going in and they'll create another dub plate and then another sound and another sound. And so the idea with the work is actually, if you don't really listen to the words, actually there's a great vibe to it. But then maybe when you actually listen to what's being said, there could be something much deeper or much more referential in there. So in terms of the work, it's the idea, it's a bit of a remix. So it's taking one idea, and whether it's giving it a veneer or giving it, flipping it on its head. So what you see, there'll be there'll be aspects of it that you can identify with, but then if you look a bit deeper, there'll be another story that's being told, or that's being shared. And in that kind of sing-song Jamaican way, it's also quite playful. Even, or if you go back to songs like Judge Dredd, talking about the Rude Boys, who are either quite violent or quite notorious, actually it's turned into this song, so everyone's dancing, but actually you're talking about locking up people who've committed crimes. But actually there's been a way of actually turning something quite heinous into a means of social commentary, and also the ability to be able to communicate through dance and through sound and through other frequencies. So I like the idea of, with my work, to be able to either, whether it's remix, repurpose, or create these new dub plates of visual and oral layers together.
Mm. And And there's something in fashion, because I also actually studied architecture, and I'm an architect, but I also do look at fashion and with excitement, and maybe, you know, doing things that may look like fashion. But one thing with discovering this world of, let's call it fashion, but we can expand on that notion, is that there are a lot of buzzwords. There are a lot of buzzwords, and one of those buzzwords is culture.
Yeah.
And you know, the reason why I thought it'd be fantastic to talk to you is because in your work, I do see culture in a kind of authentic sense, but I'd quite like to understand your understanding of it, because again, it can become a buzzword, or it can, same as authenticity, same as all the other things that we tend to identify as values.
Yeah. So
that we don't really understand or not able to critically examine.
So a lot of the terms become other aspects of commercialism in order for selling more products. And so fashion is an industry that I largely work within, but my work generally I try to reference it around style, attitude, and identity. So the aspect of creating fashion in terms of something that has a limited lifespan is not something that really resonates with me. It's the idea that something can have an essence of fashion, but really it's about someone's identity and the attitude that has way more strength than actually what you're wearing. It's more than the garments. It's the skin we're in. It's how we hold ourselves, and it's how we communicate as a social tool, as a friendly tool, or as a bridge builder. And so culture definitely, I yeah, I I hate what essentially become buzzwords, but they become buzzwords because as brands wish to sell more product, they take these terms and euphemisms essentially more to make more money. And the idea behind what I do in terms of when it's a starting point, it's not really caring what that aspect is. The identity of whatever it is that I'm creating has to come first, and the commerciality of it comes second. Because once it starts being that we use a term to be able to sell more product, then clearly I'm not really caring about culture per se or people per se. It's purely about my top or bottom lines of the returns that I need on my investment. And so therefore it's a very different practice when these words get used, because a lot of people don't even know what their own brand culture is. And so they'll use the term culture, but if you were to ask them what what are the values within your brand culture, oh, we make nice clothes, but is that a value? No, it's a product. What is it that you bring together? Um, I used to really admire different style tribes because which would define different aspects of society for good and for bad. I don't think it was always good, but the idea that you would know that if someone's a mod, you know what they stand for as a community and as a tribe. Or if someone's into rave, it's not also about what they wear, it's about how they sound, how they speak, where they eat. It's all the different aspects that make up their lifestyle. But as when the generation that we're part of now, which in some ways is really good, where a lot of those restrictions, the bad aspect of style tribes or subcultural groups were around, it just meant that it's open season for everything, but it then often just means that society or industry will just gravitate or grab hold of certain euphemisms within the current vernacular in order just to get you to buy more things. And if that's purely your referencing point, then you've missed the fact that your audience is smart enough to be able to see through that anyway. And so therefore it should be about a sharing rather than a selling. It should be someone used a phrase, which was the idea of it's more about storytelling should be about the sharing of culture rather than the selling of culture. So whatever those elements are, it should be what I share with you as opposed to what I need from you in order to make that transaction succinct.
So when you see yourself as a cultural curator,
Yes.
What is your role?
My role is to be able to share story, share narrative, showcase detailing of different aspects of whatever the particular given narrative may be that's being shared that may otherwise been overlooked or not shared before. It's bringing out, it's that point of digging beneath the surface and actually, so it's almost like a point elements of cultural archaeology where actually
Like understanding
yeah,
complexity.
yes, and presenting some of those things that otherwise from whichever the culture that you're referencing, some of those things may not be commonly shared or commonly known within that culture. And if they're not known within that culture, the chances are they may not be known in the wider culture as well. So it's about an unearthing and then a representing and then also maybe my take on it as well. So it's from my point of view of what does that look like or how could that be viewed and represented for people to digest it.
And is that also something that defines you as a, say, stylist? Or is that another
Um,
buzzword that needs to be redefined and
that's enough.
revisited?
And I think so often the redefining comes because language is now so open,
Yeah.
but or information, sorry, information is so open, but the knowledge that goes along with the information does not sit hand in hand. So we have access to so much information which improves our vocabulary, but that doesn't necessarily improve our intellect or understanding of the terminology that we use. So um as it and because so many people now adopt these terms and adopt these titles, and it's often the idea of being in my own lane, and it's not about being separatist or elitist, but I have certain stories that I wish to share and wish to tell, and so many people adopt these kind of adopt these titles, and then my perception is that you just get all blended into this gene pool of everyone saying they're a stylist, they're a creative director, they're an art director, they're a this, and very often um, that the truth isn't necessarily there in it, and so it's often the reframing is about how do I find a terminology that best expresses which is outside of the cultural and societal terms that are currently being used to define something. Because I want my voice to be heard, but not within the Malay or kind of the deluge of kind of a term that actually this is the Wikipedia for it and the other 5,000 other people use this term and this is therefore what it means. It's kind of that doesn't necessarily sum up the total parts of the work that I engage with. And because culture is so important to what I bring, say, to style and those referencing, it's the idea that it's not an identikit and it is really about presenting the soul of the matter and the attitude of something more so than actually it being about clothing. It may not be about clothing at all. It may be about a point of view.
And I guess there is an element of meaning.
Hopefully.
But I'm just wondering, how does that element of meaning come through clothes? Because I think, again, clothes is something that, so now back, if we just go back to the previous
Yeah.
question, and also put clothes at the center of the conversation.
Yeah.
That also has a kind of element of superficiality attached to it. I mean, fashion world has a, for me, I've kind of stepped away from architecture and I've explored all these other worlds. And in some sense, I've regained appreciation for architecture, because I think architecture has an element of knowing what it is. And also these kind of superficial layers that some other creative disciplines, such as fashion, are quite prone to. I think in architecture there is less of, because the terms are clearer,
They are, but I'd also within the world of architects, even if not in the world of architecture, there is a certain culture and a terminology which has not a superficiality, but something that brings a bit of an exclusion zone that separates the haves from the have-nots, as in the haves being those that have that architecture language and understanding. And very often that happens within fashion, where actually we're all in the club because we know what's just come out, or we know the referencing point to this. And often the terminology that we use within these creative mediums is was what brings about an exclusivity, which also can be a superficiality within that, because it's we're in the know, but actually you're not in, so therefore you're not part of our gang, you're not part of our club. So and it's trying to find ways of making what I do more egalitarian and more inclusive for the
Okay, but
story.
can I challenge you just slightly?
Please
Because
go for it.
I think the issue with fashion is that is a product that is available for all, but it's not available for all, right? So there is this kind of question of having something, which I think creates a whole additional level of anxiety.
Yes.
So I don't know how.
But for me, so much of that is just about marketing and the idea that you can look at an image of Patti Smith, or you can look at a Bob Marley or James Dean or David Bowie, and they in their entirety exude everything that we would say is about the type of attitude that I would say is fashionable, which stands above the commerciality of the having of this thing. For me, that's where the commercialism comes back in to subvert us back into. It's like the candy in the window. It's kind of let me dangle the sweet things in front of you. So it creates a generation or cultures of magpies who go after these things, but actually that's not really the thing. If you think about someone like an Albert Elbaz and the way that he would design and look at garment and look at form and how he would adore the female body, and actually the adornment is about a celebration. And so for me, when I think about style fashion, it's about a celebration, it's about a statement, it's about a social comment. It's not about the having and the not having and all of that stuff. That stuff I'm like, bruh, not interested.
But it's kind of everywhere. It's what
Oh yeah,
generates the
it's
interest in
it's
fashion,
it,
right?
it's there, and I just think that the education process should start much earlier. The importance of cloth and why and how it's been used in different contexts. And the one thing is that we all inhabit architecture for the body, and we all inhabit spaces, but actually there's not enough it's not broken down enough for us to understand. Actually, some people, when they wear clothes, it actually it's used as armor to be able to protect them against the environments that they have to be in. It's not purely about a presentation of themselves, it's actually a protection. And so it's understanding that fashion can be all of those really frivolous, easy going and um, engaging things. But for some people, when they wear clothes, if you take it to like the Black Panthers, or you take it to other different groups within history or within the now, where actually what I'm wearing, it's been used time and time again now as fashion, but actually this is survival. It's not just, so when I think about fashion, actually when people present themselves, it's not purely about it's not fashion as a commodity, it's fashion as preservation and self-preservation.
Okay. But is there, but so the element of art form
Yes.
is also, right, somehow put in relationship to, because what you were saying about these incredibly crafted garments, it is that they are an art piece,
Or can be, not
or can be.
yeah, or have artistic endeavor, not necessarily art where you would separate. It can, fashion obviously can embody that for sure, but not every piece of fashion obviously is a piece of art. And so, and similar with art, it's very subjective in terms of what one finds really inspiring and and soul moving. Another will just be like but so it's kind of, but it's knowing, it's about seeing the craft and appreciating the craft, or craftspersonship that goes into kind of um, the reworking of fabrics, or how something will make you sit or make you stand, or make essentially how it makes you feel. So therefore enhances how you conduct yourself and how you engage with one another, which therefore it comes back to being another layer that supports the identity of who you are or what you want to present.
Is there a hierarchy? So we have clothes, fashion, people, photography, culture, narratives.
Yeah.
There's other things that you process as creative tools. Is there a hierarchy in your tools? It's like, what comes first? What's it, you know?
No, it's communism all the way. Everyone is the same. And
it's a flat line.
Flat line, yeah. It's all lateral. No. And identity, I think, is pretty high up. Yeah, on what 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 is the essence, what is the essence of that being, of what's being created. And for me, once the identity probably comes high up. If I'm casting a shoot or a show, very often I will street cast rather than going through model agencies. And the idea is that the person who embodies what needs to be worn, it's some of that spirit that needs to come through. And so that person could be, it's not just, oh, it's not just flicking through a catalogue and,
but he's already wearing that somewhere
yeah,
on the street.
yeah. And the idea is that we wear clothes, clothes don't wear us. And that's for me where the difference between, say, style and fashion happens, where fashion is often that we're often wearing a garment, where we're wearing a garment, as opposed to us embodying and the clothes just enhancing who we are. And so that's where for me it's about who am I, or who is it that I'm bringing, what story am I telling, and what that person brings in how they stand, how they smoke, or how they exhale, or how they smile. That for me is as important as their height and their and their and their bodily statistics, and in terms of what they bring to that kind of, to that presentation of themselves.
Okay, and then, but then there is an element of capturing that, right?
Yes.
So presumably photography being very, I guess, quite critical in how we perceive your
Yeah.
work. So what's your relationship with the photographer, photography, image?
Good question.
Thanks.
No, there's been a few. um, there was a level of timelessness, and the idea that, as we touched on earlier, because there's different aspects to my practice and the workflow when engaging in photographic project. It's the idea that whatever we create within that moment needs to kind of last a certain aspect of time, because I'm not constantly shooting every week. So when I do shoot, the the intention that goes into it is to be able to create something that will still look relevant in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years time. So some of the work on my website are images which have been shot maybe nearly 20 years ago, but actually they still are able to live alongside something that got shot maybe 2 months ago. And so the approach that I go through is the people that I work with are who are capturing an essence that isn't necessarily referencing the now, it's referencing the moment that we're trying to bring together. So therefore that moment has its own integrity, and therefore should be able to be looked at any point, and not like, oh, actually that so clearly was shot of a certain time. Or yeah, maybe sometimes you shoot things with a time in mind, but the idea is that everything should be able to have its own intentionality and be able to be viewed as its own work in itself, and not therefore reflective or responding to something that's around. So I think
Yeah.
that's kind of how, and the kind of photographers that I work with are people that tell certain stories. There's a photographer that I work a lot with in Japan, Tatsuo Suzuki. I stumbled across his work on Instagram a number of years ago, and when I went to Japan, there's a time when he had this small exhibition on, and went up to him and said, look, I'd really love to work with you at some point. And again, that he didn't have much English, as I don't have tons of Japanese vocab, but enough to get around. And this project came about where I was commissioned by this body to present this project on Japanese leather working techniques, and they needed to do an installation in the UK. And they'd seen one of my previous projects, and they said, look, we'd love you to do it. How do you think we should go about it? And I said, well, look, it makes sense that we tell the story of Japanese punk culture. And so we tell the story of culture, and in that way, people can experience the leather through those that are wearing the garments, rather than us having tons of swatches of how you're washing and your dyeing techniques. And so this photographer, there was a spirit within his imagery which had this high contrast black and white, a kind of a frenetic but moments captured in this imagery. And Tatsuo would say to me, but how did you find me? Instagram is so vast and so many. I said, I have no idea, but there was something about your work that that
Maybe
stopped me in my
algorithm,
tracks.
algorithm, algorithm knew.
Yes, maybe it did. And that was even before it was as deep as the algorithm um, constraints that are now. And then and we built up this beautiful friendship. And it just so turns out that, unbeknownst to me, that he was in a punk band in in his teen
Oh,
years, in his
wow.
mid 50s. And so I had no, he played bass, and I had no knowledge of that in his work, but there was something in his work. And so I
Cool.
became the first person that had commissioned him to shoot something, and say commercially, but it wasn't so much a commercial project. Um, and so we built up this relationship from there, and then we shot together a number of editorial projects for magazines. And what I would always love is that he wasn't a fashion photographer, but he documented what he saw on the street. And so his approach had a fashion essence to it, or there's something that captured people in motion, in movement, that froze time whilst there was still motion happening in that freezing. And it's the idea of working with people that are able to bring a sensibility, often with motion within their work, even within the stillness of the image, but able to tell and share something that I don't see in what's around me. So therefore it can sit again on its own, in its own time and space. And the images that we've shot over the years, I still have this emotive feeling because of the way that he works. And he'd never done a fashion shoot before. So when we started shooting editorial together, where I'm art directing the model and saying, he was just kind of shooting the way. And he's like, well, how do you want me to do it? I was like, I just want you to be you. And that's what I want out of this. I want you to bring the best elements of you in the same way. And there's almost a Bruce Gilden way in which he works, where he will go up to people on the street, maybe not as aggressive, but or a William Klein, where you're again, it's what's happening in front of me and framing these street moments, but for now and with through his eyes of what he's seeing now, and so it's bringing that elements, I guess, the elements that I love about the fast pace of the city, that actually fashion could work through your lens, because you also don't regard fashion, you just look at people and you look at light and you look at reflection and reflection. So for me, it's about working with people that freeze moments in time that can then be another offering for people to look at things in a different way.
And you've almost just answered the question that I was going to ask about authenticity, because I think you kind of explained how you identify authenticity, because it's another of those buzzwords that can often be misunderstood. Yeah. And, you know, do you have anything to add on authenticity, or this was the answer to this question? Because
retrospectively,
yeah.
I think it's always important for there to be a connection for the people that I work with. And so the idea that it's not about their status. It's the idea that everybody is equal. I always will say to people, if someone's front of house isn't that approachable or able to be engaged with, then I would have questions about the institution or the building that I've gone into. So for me, treating everybody equally is how I will process this. And so therefore, who becomes the right documenter or the right artiste to be able to collaborate with, because of the truth that they bring out in their work. It's not a case of, oh, actually, you're really cool, or you're really influential, or you're actually, what stories do you tell, and how do we bring the authenticity of your eye and your respect for what's in front of your lens to be able to share these stories. So for me, it's the authenticity is in working with people who have an affinity or an integrity to whatever it is that we need to capture, not just having someone because they have a lens.
And when we now just briefly reflect back to this question of fashion, and you know, I think you've already said that you don't fashion isn't necessarily the fashionable, and that fashion isn't necessarily final collection of this and that brand, but it's something far deeper and much more culturally kind of embodied in the culture. But how do you then bridge that gap with that commercial world, with the world of, you know, spring, summer, and winter, autumn?
So it's taking all of the identity and cultural referencing and applying it to a particular brand and what it is that they wish to share. So it's understanding that there's a communication that also has to work on a commercial level. It can't be so raw and kind of and rooted in the essence that therefore it would obscure or obstruct people's understanding. There's an understanding that there is still a business, but the starting points will not be the business. The starting points will be here and here. And it's how do we get to the closest points where it's as true as possible, but actually it's got a role, it's got a purpose and a role to kind of to play out. And so it can't be purely the idea that it's just this because this is the essence, because at the end of the day they're asking me to be able to find a solution or enable them to create other questions that will allow other engagement. And so it can't be alienating in any way or separatist. It's still got to be inclusive, and it's about sharing and taking people, it's about holding someone's hand in certain instances and actually come with me, or inviting them into your space, come into this space and dine with me, and this is what we're doing. It's not, I'm not going to just feed you through the letterbox or actually stay outside. Actually, we're doing this together. And in terms of telling those stories, it's about bringing new people into the audience, and with the existing audience, actually we're together, so we're going to sway together, and it's almost like a dance. It's almost like, if you take something like capoeira, it's kind of the idea that you can play and things will kind of take different shapes, but actually there's an interaction of the bodies working together. So I will go this way, and actually I want you to come this way with me, because this shape is really important. So it's, how do we bring those elements together when I'm working with a brand? And actually there's the brand, there's what they're trying to say, and then there's the audience. And it's knowing that all of those kind of need to work together. Otherwise, if the audience can't work with the story, then actually I've not done my job as a communicator.
But is there also an element of bringing in elements of the brand into, well, like combining cultures, combining brands and styles? And
Yes, definitely. It's about
so
enabling.
sorry, so then if there is a kind of element of curation, so picking and choosing, you're also in a position of assigning value to things. So you're in a position of judging what you think is good,
Yes.
in fact. And so how do you then handle that kind of responsibility or authority almost?
Because when collaborating, it's coming with my sensibilities, but with an understanding of objectivity. So, or my subjectivity with a brand objectivity, and it's having those two things being able to sit hand in hand. So, and that's the separation, maybe from where we started. The idea that, from maybe as an artist, I start from a point of view, or one starts from a point of view, is what is my question that I'm asking. Whereas when I'm collaborating or being commissioned, it's like, what is their question that they're asking of me? So it's not purely about my understanding or my reflections, but it's my reflection in answer or in sharing with their question. There's an artist that I work with that they say that the words on when they write a novel, the words only become alive not when they've written them, not when we have read them, but when those words have been shared, and that's when the words come alive. And it's the idea that in that combination, this this mini cosmos only works when actually the sharing means that the audience have engaged and then reshared it again. So the objectivity has got to be about the third person communication of said project. Otherwise, it's just me kind of living out through my vanities, or me just allowing them to live out their own brand isms and ways of being. But actually, the objective is for dialogue to take place, so it becomes a conversation that it's not an echo chamber. It's how do we communicate with one another, and that communication between audience and brand together that I will help facilitate and curate, is that's the conversation that I wish to really take place. And 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 so therefore my job is to be able to facilitate that communication.
And to almost make it transmissible, right? Yeah. That's quite interesting, because I guess that maybe goes back to the kind of earlier notion that it's like when you bring one culture in relationship to the other, what you're doing, you're actually introducing this culture to that culture and that culture to that
And
culture.
so, for sure. And so that idea behind those things is it should be a conversation. And so many of the things that came out of last year, out of, say, Black Lives Matter, come back to a finite point of a lack of communication and a lack of understanding. Whereas if more dialogue, which there would create more questions, and when you have answers, there then becomes more understanding and more sharing, then it's much easier, or there's much more potential that a clearer understanding and communication can take place.
There was something about growing up in England and this relationship to, I think it was quite nice how you were explaining hanging out around Tower of London and
So
that kind of.
it's taken me a while to realize that I had this love for militaria, and I could never understand or pinpoint what that was or where it came from. And it was only a few years ago when doing a presentation, and it may have been the one that I did for LJMU, where as I was preparing the presentation, oh yes, this is probably it. The idea that my mum worked as a telephonist at the Tower of London, and I would spend my summer months going on the tours, so learning so much about English history and that being drenched in me. And then you had the official soldiers based there, which are the Yeoman Warders, and then the Gurkhas were based there as well. And so this Nepalese kind of troop that are based there. And so from a very formative age, uniform was around me and that militaria, because I could never understand why insignia and ritual and detailing, because I would claim to be a pacifist, and that there's nobody else in my family who other than one cousin who's in the RAF in or RAF equivalent in Jamaican Defence League. And he's not somebody that I speak to regularly. So that understand that connection with military, it never made sense until I was doing this presentation, and so that's why I ritual and why I like elements of ceremony, and also probably a lot of the ideas of my understanding of style and referencing also came from there, because a lot of my work has a level of embellishment. And if I think back to the Tower of London and Yeoman Warders and all of that regalia, and I still now collect elements of military epaulettes and braiding and detailing, which will influence a lot of my work, it clearly can only have come from that place, because there's no other aspect within my upbringing and nurture where I would have any connection to said military.
And why do you think? Why do you think you're not a fashion designer?
Wow, um, what a question. Um, and I think I've seen many horror stories of friends kind of
Oh
building
no,
projects.
that's not.
That's not the answer. And
No.
I, I, I don't, for me, what I've realized over the last number of years is that, which I think takes me back to when I was learning about interior architecture, is the idea of me being really interested in people, but people within spaces. So the idea of when I look at what people wear, at fashion, it's within a context of the body's relationship to a space. That doesn't necessarily answer why I'm not a fashion designer, but the more I kind of interrogate my processes as a creative, it's about people and their relationship to space. Not as I see myself as an architect, but it's the clothes, the clothing, the extra skins and the layers and that interaction. And I think essentially what's really important to me, I guess, is quite often the social aspect, and it is that communication. Of course, that is a dialogue that many fashion designers bring, but for me, there's an oral and a physical communication aspect that I'm inspired to be able to tell those stories through, not only through this layer, but it's this layer in conjunction with the environment that this layer is in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's a kind of similar. It's similar to asking curator, "Why are you not an artist?" Because it's a person that knows so much about art that you always think, hmm. But it's exactly that. I think that it's within that communication and facilitating dialogue.
Yeah, for me, it's the talking. This I find really fascinating, and I find there's so many people that um, do it so effortlessly. And I think you talked earlier about the fact that there's many different aspects to my practice. Um, I engage with the aspects of my practice that I find quite effortless, and